Hi, friends. Good to see you. My name is William Edelglass. I'm Director of Studies at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. And I am happy to say that we are exploring a Buddhist teacher tonight who looks a little bit different and sounds a little bit different from some of the other Buddhist teachers who we sometimes explore, and has a little bit of a different energy. And I'm really glad to be doing this. So, again, my name is William Edelglass. I'm Director of Studies at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, which is located on the traditional lands of the Nipmuc Nation. And before introducing our speaker tonight, my friend Ralph Craig, I'd like to give you some sense of how our time together will unfold. First, though, let me say that if you would like to see closed captions, that is, if you'd like to see what is being said simultaneous to the way it's being said, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a circle with 3 dots in it that says more. And then if you open that up, it says CC for closed captions. And if you click on that, you can get the closed captions, the written version of what is being said. So this evening we'll begin with me posing questions to Ralph, and then later in our time together, there'll be an opportunity for anyone to ask questions. If you have a question at any time, you can feel free to send it to me in the chat, and I'll collect the questions and then pass them on to Ralph after I've asked some of my own. I suspect there will be more questions than there's time for, and I apologize for that. And if you're having any technical issues, you should feel free to send an email to contact@buddhistinquiry.org. And I want to thank my friend and colleague, Christy, who is taking care of all the logistical background work that needs to happen to make something like this possible. So thank you, Christy. Before we start, I love to see where everyone's calling from. We're going to have the chat mostly for the evening set up so that you can only chat to the hosts. But for now, maybe you could just put in the chat to everybody where you're calling from and what your name is. And Springfield, Philadelphia, West Indies, Malaysia, Philadelphia, Columbia, Maryland, Massachusetts, Miami, Florida, Maine, Bogota, Colombia. Welcome, Darren. Virginia, Colorado. I am still amazed. Ventura, California. Still amazed by how this works, that we can all be together. So welcome, everyone. And I am particularly excited that we are here with Ralph H. Craig III, who is an interdisciplinary scholar of religion, whose work mostly focuses on South Asian Buddhism and also American Buddhism. He received his Ph.D. from one of the premier programs in Buddhist Studies at Stanford. And his focus of his research, it includes memoir, race, popular culture, yoga, meditation theory, religious experience, and authority. And speaking of authority, he works with textual materials in Sanskrit, Pāli, Buddhist Chinese, and Classical Tibetan. He's currently working on a book that reads Mahayana Buddhist Sutras as preacher, the role of the preacher in Mahayana Buddhist Sutras. And tonight, I'm very excited. We will be talking about his 2023 book, Dancing in My Dreams, a spiritual biography of Tina Turner, which explores the place of religion in the life and career of Tina Turner. and really focuses on her as a Black Buddhist teacher. I should say this is one of those wonderful books that is both accessible to most readers as well as making important and significant contributions to scholarship in Buddhist studies. So thank you so much for being here, Ralph. I'm really excited about our conversation. I've learned a lot from you from previous conversations, and I look forward to tonight. So in my introduction, I noted that you work with a lot of classical Buddhist texts in multiple languages, and we'll spend most of our evening on Tina Turner. But let's start, if you wouldn't mind, on you. Maybe you could share a little bit about how you came to Buddhist studies and your interest in the classical materials and preaching, and maybe connect that then to your work on Tina Turner.
Yes. Well, first, I want to say thank you so much, William, for inviting me. And thank you to Christy for holding down the tech fort and everyone at the Berry Center and everyone joining. I really appreciate you taking your Sunday night. Sunday is a sacred day for me. I don't tend to do anything on Sundays or participate in anything. So thank you to everyone for doing that. I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the majority of my family is Catholic. And there's also kind of a Baptist contingent to my family and a big kind of Pentecostal wing. So I think I grew up, very much interested in these preachers and bishops and priests and all of these kinds of figures of religious authority. But like many in the home, family members, various family members of mine were the religious authority figures, right? So I was not going to church or something with the preacher, right? I was going with a family member, right, who was most interested in going, or members of my family. So there was this attunement from the beginning to religious authority in spaces outside of formal religious institutions. And I think that many of my interests in religious authority, but religious authority, right, in and around and outside of formal religious institutions, I think has its roots there, right? Kind of paying attention to the world around me growing up. In my scholarly life, my interests are, of course, in Buddhist studies, right? And in the field of Buddhist studies, a subfield of religious studies. So I look at, as William was saying, I look at South Asian Buddhist material, text, Mahayana Buddhist text, and whatnot. And my research also looks at the transmission of Buddhism into the United States, right? And so American Buddhist traditions. So it is this constellation of interests that brings me to and brought me to Tina Turner, right? And reading Tina Turner as a Black Buddhist woman and as a Buddhist teacher, which I'm sure we will get into.
Great. Thank you. Maybe we could follow up on what you just shared about religious authority
Mm-hmm,
outside of formal institutions. And
mm-hmm,
I'm thinking about the first chapter of your book,
mm-hmm,
taken from one of Tina Turner's songs, Motherless Child.
mm-hmm,
Um, you describe Tina Turner having two really remarkable grandmothers, very different
mm-hmm.
and very influential. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about these grandmothers and how through them Turner engages both the Black church traditions and also African American nature-based mysticism. And perhaps, if
Mm-hmm.
you would be willing, you also talk about Yolanda Pierce's term grandmother theology,
Mm-hmm.
which is, according to Yolanda Pierce, a subset of womanist theology that explores the generational wisdom and theological reflections of Black grandmothers. I'm wondering if you could say something about this place of religious authority with the grandmothers in Tina Turner's life?
Yes. So Dr. Yolanda Pierce's work, it's so central for me and so fascinating for me, especially in that chapter, because what she is doing is naming the ways in which uh, grandmothers, in particular, Black grandmothers, African American grandmothers, are often held to be and seen as and fulfill this role as this repository of family wisdom, right? As this kind of matriarchal figure who is this repository of family wisdom and religious knowledge, and thus a source of theological insight. That is to say, that what Yolanda Pierce is arguing is that the wisdom and the religious wisdom that Black grandmothers dispense, is itself theological work. It is, as they say in womanist circles, right? It is God talk, so to speak, right? It is theology. So this became central for me because what I noticed in reading Turner's life, and Tina Turner as a public figure has this vast public archive, right? So it's her own writings, her, 3 published memoirs, but it's also books, there are also books about her. And then there are interviews that she has given and documentaries on her life and so on and so forth. So there's this vast public archive of Tina Turner's. And in reading this archive, something that becomes very clear for her is the centrality of her grandmothers, of these 2 grandmothers that had this enormous influence on her, because Tina Turner's parents were uh, traveling for work, moving for work, and there were kind of marital issues in the home. And all of this meant that Turner and her sister and some of her cousins and whatnot, they kind of moved around, right, amongst various family members. And so these 2 figures emerge as central for Turner's religious formation, her spiritual formation. Her paternal grandmother, who was Black Baptist, uh, and her maternal grandmother, who was involved in what people like the late womanist theologian Rosemary Freeney Harding names as the kind of Southern African American mystical tradition, or the African American mystical tradition, or what as scholars might term Black Southern religious culture. So Turner's maternal grandmother was deeply enmeshed in those traditions, and those traditions are kind of nature-based mysticism, this attunement to the place and the significance of dreams, signs, visions, omens, environment, the natural environment around them, and so forth. But she then had, as I said, this paternal grandmother who was kind of stereotypically Bible thumping, you might say. And Turner had to live with this grandmother and often said that she got the intensity of her prayer life, her grandmother's kind of intense prayer life. That was just keeping the home clean and tidy and kind of strict discipline in the home. And outside of the home, always at church, something always going on at the church. And her paternal grandmother being a major figure in their local Baptist church. So Turner essentially represents a blend of these 2 figures, right? As a little girl and growing up in Nutbush, Tennessee, and in Brownsville, Tennessee, Turner attended the local churches there, particularly Woodlawn Missionary Baptist Church, which is still there, still in operation. But she also, right, had this influence coming from her maternal grandmother, right? And the things that she noted about her maternal grandmother as being spiritually significant for her. And the last thing I will say about that is then when her parents moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, or near Knoxville, Tennessee, they also began attending, and her mother began attending a Pentecostal church, a Black Pentecostal church. And Turner often spoke about how that influenced her, particularly the energy of that and the instruments and all of that. And Turner sang herself as a little girl, sang in the choir at Woodlawn Missionary Baptist Church, and also another local church. So this is the way that these two grandmothers influence her. And this is exactly what Yolanda Pierce is naming with grandmother theology, the way for so many African Americans, their religious and spiritual formation deeply indebted to the theological reflections, right, and the theological uh, creations, really, of their grandmothers.
Great, thank you, Ralph.
Mhm.
So in the spring of 1996, Tina Turner releases her Wildest Dreams album,
Mhm.
which is followed by her wildly successful Wildest Dreams tour.
Mhm.
And you use Wildest Dreams kind of as a framework for thinking about the trajectory of her life.
Mhm.
And she talks about having two wildest dreams. Can you just say what they were and kind of unpack them a little to give us a sense of what she understands the trajectory of her life to be?
Right. So thank you for bringing up the kind of wildest dreams image. Actually, the original title of the book was going to be Wildest Dreams, but there was a feeling that that might, when you Google Wildest Dreams, Tina Turner comes up, but also Taylor Swift comes up, and so we took, or I took, the title of a song on the Wildest Dreams album as the title of the book. So that's where the Dancing in My Dreams title comes from. But for Turner, she often spoke about in her interviews and in her writings these kind of two major dreams that she had. One dream is commercial success, specifically as represented by filling stadiums. Turner built her career as a live performer, right? A successful recording artist, very successful. But she put a lot of emphasis on her live performances, right? And that even dates back to the early part of her career with the Ike and Tina Turner Review, right? So, being that she put so much stock in her live performances as kind of the bread and butter of her career as an artist, she spoke about this dream to be a hugely successful rock artist as a Black woman, to become known as the queen of rock and roll and to fill football stadiums around the world, right? And that represented for her then, as she wrote and spoke about, this represented, right, kind of the ultimate career success. That's the first wildest dreams. But at the same time, because in the 70s, Turner had converted to Buddhism, started practicing Buddhism in 1973, Turner also aligned that dream of commercial success with her Buddhist practice, and that she had this dream to one day become a Buddhist teacher, right? To one day convey in an authoritative manner the Buddhist teachings and practices that she held and engaged in. And so these two dreams, then, for the latter half of Turner's life, become the kind of guiding, right, her two guiding dreams, right, her wildest dreams, to have that kind of commercial success and use that commercial success as a vehicle to share her Buddhist teachings with the world. And so this is where the idea then of the wildest dreams kind of metaphor for the book comes from. And she develops what I call in chapter 5 of the book a wildest dreams rock aesthetic. That is a way in which, right, religion and commercial success are intimately tied and become a major part of her brand as a public figure, right? That she sees herself as representing hope, possibility, and the ability to transform trauma and suffering, right? And even poverty, you might say, right? So, race, class, sexism, all of these issues, to transform all of these experiences into success, both you might say internal success and external success, right? This becomes what I call the wildest dreams rock aesthetic, a significant part of Turner's public brand.
So she encounters Buddhism in 1973.
Mm-hmm.
And by 1975, she's identifying herself publicly as a Buddhist.
Mm-hmm.
And the Buddhism that she encounters is Soka Gakkai, Nichiren Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
In the community that's around the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, which has a history coming out of the Vipassana tradition,
Mm-hmm.
so we're ecumenical. I suspect there are some people who may not know a whole lot about Soka Gakkai and or Nichiren. I'm wondering, maybe start and say a few things about Nichiren.
Yeah.
That might be going back too far. I don't know. But maybe trace a little bit about this Buddhism that she then practices and practices very sincerely, at times 4 hours a day.
Right.
So maybe you could start with giving us a sketch of the landscape of Nichiren Buddhism and Soka Gakkai.
Yes. So Nichiren Buddhism is named, of course, after the 13th century monk Nichiren, right? Sometimes called Nichiren Shonin or Nichiren Daishonin. And Nichiren, living in the 13th century Japan in what's often called the Kamakura period or era, right? The society around him is very chaotic, right? The government is transitioning. There's famine. There's the threat of invasion, right? There are earthquakes. There are all of these issues going on, both in the natural environment, right, in Japan, but also in the socio-political situation. And Nichiren saw himself as seeking to understand why this is occurring when the nation is at least nominally Buddhist, right? At least culturally Buddhist. Buddhist traditions proliferate in medieval Japan, are proliferating. And Nichiren says, and yet Buddhist sutras promise prosperity and promise, the well-being of people and societies that hold these teachings and yet hold to the Dharma. And yet he sees evidence that Japan is, from one perspective, in decline in his day. And so as he seeks to understand why that is, it becomes clear to him that this is because of the neglect of the Lotus Sutra. So he develops an exclusive devotion to the Lotus Sutra. He is not the first to, of course, center on the Lotus Sutra, but he develops an entire doctrinal framework and practice framework centered around exclusive devotion to the Lotus Sutra, and in particular, chanting the title of the Lotus Sutra in the form of the mantra Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, or sometimes shortened to Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, right? So Myoho Renge Kyo is the you might say the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese characters of Kumarajiva's translation of the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra, right? The Mahayana Buddhist text known as that we now call the Lotus Sutra. So he develops this exclusive devotion to the Lotus Sutra, right? And his followers further that tradition in various ways, right? This tradition of exclusive devotion of the Lotus Sutra centered specifically on chanting the title of the Lotus Sutra. Fast forward, so that's the 13th century in Japan. Now we will jump forward to the 20th century in Japan, when in 1928, two educators, Saburo Makuguchi and Jose Toda, convert to Nichiren Buddhism. They start practicing Nichiren Buddhism. Right? And eventually, as educators, they found an educational society called the Soka Gakkai, the Society for the Advancement, you might say, of an educational, a pedagogical theory centered around the creation of value. Right? This organization eventually shifts its focus from educational purpose, like school education, to a religious body, right? And that was particularly under the second president of that organization, Jose Toda. And under the organization's third president, Daisaku Ikeda, who passed away in November 2023, under the third president of the organization spreads around the world and is under the umbrella of what we now call Soka Gakkai International, but still maintaining this focus on exclusive devotion to the Lotus Sutra. So for most Nichiren Buddhist traditions, most Nichiren Buddhist schools, including Soka Gakkai, the central practice is chanting the title of the Lotus Sutra and chapters of the Lotus Sutra. And that continues to this day. But Soka Gakkai in particular, especially under its second president, Jose Toda, focused on propagating Nichiren Buddhism, right? They understood Kozen Rufu, which means something like to widely declare and spread. This is a phrase that comes from the Lotus Sutra. The Nichiren took that as his mission, right? Nichiren's goal was to spread exclusive devotion to the Lotus Sutra. So all Nichiren Buddhist schools take up that mantle to spread, right, devotion to the Lotus Sutra to various ends. And Soka Gakkai is one such tradition that does this, right, that seeks to spread the teaching. And under the second president of the organization, propagation becomes the central focus of the organization, spreading Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism, or what eventually is called Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism, spreading that. And the third president of the organization then takes that global, right? Travels to many other countries to engage in this kind of propagation effort. Right? And that's how the tradition comes to the United States.
Thank you, Ralph. Do you want to say in chapter 3, you title it Tina's Prayer. Do you want to say a little bit about how, having given this background of how Soka Gakkai comes to the United States, maybe say a little bit about how it came to Tina Turner and how she takes.
Yes. So as I discussed in chapter 3 of the book, Tina's Prayer comes from a song that Turner herself wrote that had various names, but one name of the song is called Tina's Prayer. And I read the song as, since it's a song that Turner wrote, like the song Motherless Child, that the title of chapter 1 is taken from. I read chapter 3, I read the song Tina's Prayer in the context of changes in Turner's life happening by the 1970s, where she's kind of reaching her wit's end with her first husband, Ike Turner, and the issues in that marriage, the kind of what she perceives to be stalled career momentum towards the end of their partnership as the Ike and Tina Turner Review, and her own religious reflection that she is engaging in as she's starting to think about, right? She's introduced to Buddhism and all of these other traditions, and she's thinking about all of these things when she writes this song, Tina's Prayer, in 1973, released in 1973. So Soka Gakkai, as I mentioned, right, had been founded in Japan, but had been spread around the world by members of the Soka Gakkai. And the first members of Soka Gakkai began to make their way, immigrate to the United States in the 50s. But it's really in the 60s that the organization organizes its American chapter and really begins to propagate Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism in the United States, right? This begins in the 60s. And by the late 60s and early 70s, they are engaged in these massive propagation campaigns, right? They're engaged in these massive drives to spread the teachings. And so members kind of spread out in neighborhoods across the United States, right? They go door to door, almost like Jehovah's Witnesses. They stand on street corners. They place themselves in urban shopping centers, similar to the Hare Krishna movement, right? The International Society for Krishna Consciousness. This is all happening at the same time, right? The mid to late 60s and the early 70s. So Soka Gakkai joins these other religious movements in doing this street propagation and this door-to-door propagation of their teachings. And it is in this context that Turner's youngest son encounters the practice. So other people around Turner, unbeknownst to her, were also practicing, but weren't really talking about it. But one of the first people to really mention it to Turner is her youngest son, who had been given a string of prayer beads on the street in Inglewood, right? So some members of Soka Gakkai attempted to share Buddhism with Turner's younger son, shared Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism with her youngest son by giving him prayer beads and telling him, if you do this practice, you can get anything you want. And so he goes home and tells his mother is Tina Turner. He goes home and he tells his mother that he's heard about this practice, and the people and then some people in the neighborhood are engaged in this Buddhist practice. And they say, if you do this practice, you can become happy and obtain, right, the things that you want. And Turner's unhappiness was well known to those around her because of the difficulties in her first marriage and in her the early part of her career. So she hears about this first from her son, then from a recording engineer at the studio that Ike Turner owned called Bollock Sound. And then finally, she hears about it from the wife of jazz musician Walter Bishop Jr., a woman named Valerie Bishop. And this is how finally Turner is introduced to Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism. And she's told by all of these figures that if she engages in the practice of Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism, chanting the title of the Lotus Sutra and learning to chant excerpts from the sutra, that this will begin to change her life, to enable her to make the changes that she desired to make.
Ralph, you mentioned before everyone else joined us on the Zoom call that there was a clip you might want to play for us when we got to discussing this part of the book. Is this a good time to share that clip?
Yes. So this is a clip from the 2021 HBO documentary called Tina, the HBO documentary. And in this clip, Turner discusses her introduction to Buddhism and how it kind of gives her the strength to make the changes that she wants to make. A kind of trigger warning for those listening at home. The clip discusses, abuse and violence.
But I want to clarify this. She was trying to be what she thought I wanted, not what really was. She was trying to please me. And so therefore she was going through a lot of hurt. And I think she had a very unhappy life because of that. And I think we were living a lie. And if I hadn't used my head in it all, I would have known better. And so this was led to our downfall.
Being as influenced as you were by him, and him being a powerful person, how did you dare leave?
Well, I had grown, Carl. I grew because I was introduced to Buddhism. I came in one day. They walks in with this pretty woman. Her name was Valerie Bishop. I don't know where I found her. She was a chanter. She actually worked at Balik Sound for about 2 years. And she introduced Buddhism to me. Mm-hmm. And one of the things she said that it promised change. Ha ha ha, da da da, change.
Buddhism was a way out, and it changed your attitude towards the situation that you're in. The more you chant, the more, you become liberated mentally.
The mantra is Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. That is the mystical law of the universe, making you be able to manifest the things you want in your life. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, 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 Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. So I started seeing my life. I started really seeing that I had to make a change. You get into that, the sound of connecting back to the universe, making all kinds of realizations. A month later, I was singing, and then someone yelled out from the crowd, "Tina, finally you're receiving." I kept going. I started becoming much more confident. I mean, not even caring what I thought about me, becoming less afraid of it.
Ike had recognized it too, that he couldn't control her anymore because she just wasn't putting up with any of that.
So as you can see in that clip, and it goes on, and I would really recommend anyone who is interested in Turner's kind of conversion to Buddhism and whatnot, would do well to check out that Max documentary, Tina, very good. But as you can hear in the clip, for Turner, while it was appealing to her what was being shared with her, that if you engage in this practice, the practice of chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, and if you engage in that practice, you will be able to obtain the things you want, right? Even material things. What was more appealing to her was the idea that through engaging that practice, she could change her life, that she could take the steps that she needed to begin to end this unhappy marriage and this unhappy partnership that she was in, that was marred by domestic violence, right? And the clip then goes on to explain, as Turner goes on to explain, how then she is able to make her exit from that situation. But what I want to highlight is that for Turner, in her telling, this is powered by her conversion to Buddhism. It is the practice of Buddhism that enables her to break away from that situation and eventually to experience the kind of personal transformation and career success that she wrote about and spoke about seeking.
Thank you, Ralph. That's a really compelling clip. Thanks for sharing it. One of the things I also felt in reading the book and reading that chapter is that it's not just Buddhism in general, or even Soka Gakkai. She ends up somehow finding a circle of women, a group of women who she chants with, provide a refuge for her, both literally when Ike is burning cars and shooting guns, but also so they provide her a place to stay, but also they chant together and they sit together, and this idea of spiritual friendship seems to
Hmm.
be something that was really important in her life. I don't know if there's
Yes.
anything more you want to say about that.
Yes. So the Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhist organization in that time and still to this day is based on discussion meetings. So there are larger kind of group meetings at Buddhist centers, Soka Gakkai centers, but the majority of the organization's activity and the majority of the practice of that form of Buddhism takes place in people's homes and in what are called discussion groups. And so Turner, when she was introduced to Buddhism to Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism in 1973, she was still with Ike Turner, and she did not have freedom from her first husband. She did not have the freedom to attend Buddhist meetings, and Ike Turner actually tried to violently prevent her from engaging in Buddhist practice, right? But these women who Turner wrote about and referred to as her brave chanting friends, they would sneak her out of the home and kind of bring her to their home to learn about the practice and the meetings. So when she left Ike Turner, she stayed with those women. And it was in staying with those women that they began to teach her about the practice of Buddhism, the doctrines of Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism, and would chant with her and teach her. So in many ways, she credits these women with helping her to make the changes that she needed to make to transform her life at a fundamental level. Many of those women are still alive. Uh, Many of those women are still around. Some of them I interviewed and talked with extensively in the writing of the book. And what they all detail, the ways in which they would chant and study, right? They would chant for hours, sometimes 4 hours a day, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening, and study Buddhist teaching and discuss how those teachings apply to each of their own lives, but also to Turner's specific situation that she was in. So Turner was learning, like, from these women and from the discussion meetings that the organization holds. She was learning a very practical Buddhism, you might say, right? That wasn't just about the teachings, but about the specific ways in which the teachings apply to one's life. Similar to, in some ways, like a Dharma talk, right? Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhist discussion meetings are similar in many ways to the practice groups that other Buddhist communities have formed, insofar as the people at the discussion meeting practice together, and then they discuss the teachings together. And those discussions are centered on someone sharing their experience of the practice, right? What practicing Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism has done for them, and right, the practical application of the teaching.
So, speaking of the way in which this group supported Turner in becoming Turner, you have a chapter 4, which you title Becoming Tina.
Yes.
And you're talking about becoming Tina religiously, personally, professionally. Maybe you could just say a little bit about this next stage of her life with the support of these women and the support of the Buddhist practice. What does it mean to become Tina in these 3 dimensions?
Yes. So I titled the chapters the way that I did. So the first chapter, Motherless Child, is about her childhood and the difficulties of her childhood, but also the religious foundation, right, that she developed from her grandmothers. Chapter 2 is called Becoming Tina Turner, because some of the listeners on this Zoom might not realize, and many people might not realize, that Turner's birth name is not Tina Turner, right? Her birth name is Anna Mae Bullock. Ike Turner gave her the name Tina Turner, Turner coming from his name, but this is before they were even married. In 1960, gave her the name Tina Turner, created the name Tina Turner from his last name, Turner. And then Tina, he got from, it rhymed with one of his favorite figures, one of Ike Turner's favorite figures. Also a good stage name, a good alliterative stage name. Somehow Anna Mae Turner didn't quite sound like a stage name. So he names her Tina Turner, and he trademarks the name so that if she leaves him, if she were to ever leave him, he could use the name for others, right? He wouldn't lose the business entity that he had created. So chapter 2 is about how she becomes Tina Turner, where religion is in that story, but also where she is in her life and career at that point. Chapter 3, Tina's prayer, is about her conversion to Buddhism and what that does for her, how she understands Buddhism, how she discussed Buddhism, and what that did for her. But chapter 4, then becoming Tina, is really about the way in which Turner uses her Buddhist practice and what she learned in the Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhist community, but also with these Buddhist women that she spoke about that we just discussed, how Turner used that to gain self-confidence, right? In a fundamental way, to gain self-confidence and to realize that she could leave this abusive marriage and this career that she wasn't even enjoying, right? She wasn't singing what she felt she wanted to be singing. She wasn't presenting herself in the ways that she felt she wanted to present herself, but felt stuck and trapped, forced really by this marriage and this group that she was in. But through her Buddhist practice, she gains the confidence that she can leave that situation. And she does. In 1976, in July 1976, she, in the middle of a concert tour, after one final fight with a violent fight with her ex-husband, Ike Turner, she leaves him in Texas. And she makes her way back with help to Los Angeles, California. And she goes into hiding, staying largely with these women who had helped her learn about Buddhism. And in this period, then she becomes Tina, right? She divorces Ike Turner. After a prolonged fight in court, she requests and is granted the right to use her stage name, Tina Turner, in her career. But in many ways, she becomes Tina. She reformulates her image, crafts a new vision for her career, and sets out as a solo artist, right? And began appearing in a solo capacity at the end of 1976 and throughout 1977 and beyond. So that's where I'm drawing this image of becoming Tina from, how she reinvents herself largely on the basis of her Buddhist practice. And as a scholar of religion, particularly in Buddhist studies and American Buddhism and American religious traditions, I'm always asking the question, right, of how do we understand the place of religion in life transitions for a public figure, like a figure of popular culture, like Tina Turner. And in Turner's own narration of that time period in her life, between leaving her ex-husband Ike Turner in 1976 and the groundbreaking success of her 1984 album, Private Dancer, in this almost 10-year period, in this 8-year period, she reinvents herself through practicing Buddhism intensely. And so she steps up her Buddhist practice. She steps up her participation in the Buddhist organization, and her efforts to learn the teachings of Soka Gakkai and Nichiren Buddhism.
Thanks, Ralph. Since Ike Turner is with us in this conversation, the last few minutes especially, one of the things that I appreciate, well, there's several things I appreciated about your treatment of Ike. One is Tina Turner's insistence that she didn't want her life to be defined by being victimized in that
Yes.
relationship. And she didn't want people talking about her life to put that front and center. And so I've tried, that informed some of the questions I put together. The other thing that I appreciate about your treatment in the book is that you make things a little bit more understanding Ike Turner is a little bit more complex, because you go into the ways in which he was exploited as a Black performing artist and a little bit more of his context.
Yes.
It's easy enough when talking about Tina Turner to just think about Ike Turner as this villain. And I appreciate, and of course, he was violent and abusive and awful in many respects. And I appreciate the way that you give some context there.
Can I just say there about one of the hardest parts of writing the book was dealing with that part of her life and career, because as you so rightly point out, in many narratives about Turner's life, never in her own narrative about her own life, and where Turner's voice should be front and center of any discussion about her life, but in tellings of her life, in the way that her life is often memorialized by others, Ike Turner becomes this villain and this boogeyman and this the kind of antagonist to Tina Turner as, heroic protagonist. And yet if we step away from those kinds of caricatures and we look at the complex sociocultural history and the historical forces at play there, in this kind of in the mid 20th century and beyond, and you look at Ike Turner in that context, a number of things become clear. First of all, as I write in the book in chapter 2, when Tina Turner as Anna Mae Bullock meets Ike Turner in East St. Louis, she's meeting a figure that in many ways is familiar to her, to some of the men in her own life, her own father even, right? Men who are successful in various ways and within their sphere, whatever that sphere is. Turner's father was a sharecropper. Turner herself, her family, were sharecroppers, and Turner grew up picking cotton as a little girl. And that's important to understand, right? We're not talking about that long ago. And so Turner herself grows up picking cotton. Her family her family's sharecroppers. And her father, though, is fairly successful, and her mother and father do fairly well for themselves within their sphere. And so when Anna Mae Bullock, as a teen, right, meets Ike Turner, she's meeting a man who's older. He's 8 years older. He is successful. He is well dressed. He is dapper, if you will, and he is playing guitar. He's talented, and he's known for his talent locally. And so she's meeting a figure that is familiar to her, but also has some of the things that she herself wants, right? He has success. In her yearbook in high school, she wrote that she wanted to be an entertainer. She was in choir in church, and she sang at local picnics. in Nutbush, Tennessee. And by many accounts, she was a kind of active, performative young woman, always performing and entertaining others. And this was something that was deep inside of her. But as Turner herself often said, looking around her in Nutbush, Tennessee, in Brownsville, Tennessee, there weren't many outlets for that beyond church, picnics, family performances. She didn't see any way that the dream of becoming some kind of entertainer, that could even be a dream, right? The closest thing that she saw was movies, going to the movies and seeing movie stars, saying, I want to do that one day. But she didn't know anything by her own narration of her life. She didn't know anything about, success as a musician. But when she meets Ike Turner, right, she's been living in St. Louis for a few years, and she's now going to high school in St. Louis and starting to go out with her sister, Aline Bullock, and she's starting to kind of see nightlife and see performers and see another kind of success, right, local success. And Ike Turner represents all these forces, even as he himself he comes from the Mississippi River Delta, Clarksdale, Mississippi, right? A town famous for its blues culture and kind of one of the epicenters of blues, but his own home life marred with violence as well. So he and Anna Mae Bullock, who becomes Tina Turner, she often wrote about how they talked about these kinds of things, and they talked about their lives and their upbringing, and they had much in common in many of those ways. And we're talking about the backdrop of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So racism, the civil rights movement, right? The long civil rights movement, right? Which we count the long civil rights movement as really beginning with the Reconstruction era in many ways. So this is in full swing, and they're in the South. So all of these forces combine to create their musical talent, but also their personal dynamics and their interpersonal dynamics. And I worked really hard to write about that carefully and historically in the book.
I think what you just said, Ralph, maybe that leads to a question about karma.
Mm-hmm.
As you say in the book, Tina Turner has an evolving sense of what karma means, and it changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
It does a lot of work for her, and I wanted, in the last questions that I have are really about her Buddhist teaching and how she understands some of the Buddhist ideas, such as transmuting poison into medicine, and
Mm-hmm.
but maybe we'll start with karma. And I also want to invite anybody on the call, if they want to pose a question for Ralph, to just send me a chat through the Zoom chat, and I'll collect them. But maybe we could start with karma. What does karma do for Tina Turner, Ralph?
Yes, whereas I'm sure many people on the call on the Zoom, right, knows what karma means, what it is. Right. Karma means action, fundamentally, right? Actions of body, speech, and mind. And what Buddhism adds to the understanding of karma, of course, there are many Buddhist teachings on karma, but fundamentally, karma is intentional in Buddhism, right? It's intimately tied to intentionality. And like most South Asian religious traditions, for example, karma exists over lifetime, right? So it is a complex way of understanding the ways that cause and effect operates over many, many lifetimes. In the Soka Gakkai, right, this same basic Buddhist understanding of karma right? What Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhist teachings add to that is this idea that your karma is your mission, right? That whatever karma you have, whatever actions of body, speech, and mind you have accumulated over this lifetime and many lifetimes, and collectively as well as individually, all of that is your mission, right? Meaning that that's the foundation from which you can change your life. This shades then into meaning that for a Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhist, whatever you experience is for your own benefit, right? That is not to say it's good, it's not to say it's bad, right? It's not about good or bad or anything like that. It is to say that whatever you experience, right, over many lifetimes in this lifetime is all for you to transform as an example for others, right? This is the idea of changing karma into mission that comes out of Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism. For Turner, this way of understanding karma, as she learns about and develops in the 1970s, right, also then explains for her why she ended up in the complex relationship that she had with Ike Turner. Right? For Tina Turner, her Buddhist views and her religiosity is formed not just by Buddhism and not just by the Black Baptist and Black Pentecostal churches, but it's also deeply indebted to what I term in the book as American metaphysical religion, right? And this comes from the work of scholar Catherine Albanese, right? This idea that metaphysical religion is another major stream of American religiosity, right? And out of this comes these ideas about kind of harmonic correspondences, right, between the kind of the universe and the world out there and the internal world in here. Astrology gets woven into this, positive thinking gets woven into this entire constellation of ideas that also comes close to the African American mystical tradition. And the African American mystical tradition is a part of metaphysical religion and also helps to create some of the formative discourses of American metaphysical religion. This also influences Turner's religious life. So Turner is seeking a way in the 1970s, she's seeking a way to understand this relationship with Ike Turner. Why is it so violent? Where has it all, as she herself said, where did it all go so wrong? She had this vision as a child of, her idea of what a happy family meant, even though she didn't have that in her own home. But she had this idea, right, formed from many sources about what it would mean to have a happy home. And yet she ends up in this marriage, right? She ends up in this marriage that is nothing like that. The children, in her own narration of that experience, the children are afraid and she is afraid and the career is up and down and it's violent and all of these things. So none of it like the ideal marriage and career that she had envisioned. So where did it all go wrong? Now, saying where did it all go wrong puts it in the passive voice, right? It's just, why is this happening to me, right? That's the question at the core that Turner asks. But when she's introduced to Buddhism and through the metaphysical teachings that she's also learning, she begins to combine those into an understanding that it's not just happening to me. I am an agent in the situation, right? So that's why Turner really resisted, rightfully so, the label of a victim. She often spoke about the ways in which making her into some kind of victim and reading her life in a way that she herself doesn't read it at all implies that she was not thinking all along the way, not trying to understand and trying to make moves to change her life, right? But when she learns about Buddhism, Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism, and its understanding of changing karma into mission, right? She understands that this is not something happening to her, but that she has a role in it too. She is an agent, not a passive victim, but an active agent. And so the question starts to shift from her, the question changes from why is this happening to me to how do I understand what's occurring and what is my role in what is occurring and what can I do? And she begins to understand, right? She believed that she had had a previous life specifically in Egypt as an Egyptian queen, right? And that as she was in this relationship with Ike Turner in a past life, and she had stolen the throne from him and all of these kinds of things. Now, the particulars of that belief are neither here nor there. I detail them in the book. But what's important for us to understand as attentive, careful readers of Turner's life is that that understanding exists in the context, the multi-life context of karmic action, of cause and effect. And that anything in front of you is the product of it, right? Is an effect that is the product of a multitude of causes. And that anything you will see in the future, right? Anything you would like to see in the future is itself the product, right? The effect of causes you're making right now. So what she learns from Buddhism is that karma, from Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism, is that karma is fundamentally about cause and effect. And that if you want to see a particular kind of effect, you have to make particular kinds of causes. Right? Now, Turner then expands that understanding into a kind of social theory, right? That she uses this understanding of karma and her developing understanding of karma. She uses that then to understand what she sees when she travels to South Africa for the first time on tour, right? South Africa and the kind of apartheid regime and the race relations and social relations in South Africa, which she immediately identifies as being not different from the conditions that she grew up in the Jim Crow South, right? And not just Jim Crow South, right? Jim Crow America. Right. So when she goes to South Africa for the first time in 1979, she immediately identifies that these are the same kinds of circumstances that she grew up under, that many African Americans live under. But Turner reads that situation in South Africa, right? Apartheid and the social and racial relations there. She reads those in the context of Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhist teachings on karma, which we have to be very careful to distinguish from blame, right? So Turner never understands her situation or the situation of Black South Africans or Black Americans or her situation as a Black woman in the music business, right? Sexism and all of these things. She never understands them as like something she's done to herself or something someone's done to themselves. That's not the teaching of karma. The teaching of karma says that there are myriad causes that create the effect that we see in front of us. And so she spends significant amounts of time trying to understand the causes and conditions that lead to what she herself is experiencing and what she sees others experiencing.
Maybe this is a good time to jump to the last chapter, Beyond and Beyond.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about the 4 Beyond albums, and her Buddhist spiritual autobiography, Happiness Becomes You. And there, I mean, there's so much to unpack in that chapter.
Yeah.
But maybe the question, if you would be willing to address it, that comes up in response to what you were just saying is her understanding of the move from individual transformation to social collective transformation. I'm wondering if you would be willing to say a little bit about that.
Yes. So in Turner's mature teachings, right? So this event is titled "Thus Have I Heard," right? And the reason for that is because that is the traditional way that many Buddhist texts start, is "Thus have I heard," right? Where the I in question is the Buddha's chief attendant Ananda, who is supposed to have heard and memorized, or at least known about, all of the Buddha's discourses. And so Buddhist texts begin in Sanskrit with evam maya shrutam, right? Thus have I heard. Turner's first memoir, I, Tina, published in 1986, September 1986, ends with Turner saying that at that point in her life and career, she was not ready to teach, but that one day she would become a teacher and she would share what she learned, and that some would listen and some would hear. And so, for myself as a scholar, thinking about, again, religion and popular culture and the place of figures like Turner in our understanding of religion and popular culture, I began to ask myself, what do we hear when we listen to Turner? If we take Turner seriously, where she says that she wants to be one day a Buddhist teacher, right? A teacher, then what is it that she teaches? When do we understand her as making that shift, right? At what point is her career ripe enough, as she says, and her understanding ripe enough, she as a person ripe enough to be a teacher? I see her formal turn to teaching beginning in 2009 with the first Beyond album, an album of Buddhist and Christian prayers that Turner speaks a religious and spiritual message on, drawn from multiple religious traditions, but specifically rooted in Buddhism. And she shares her Buddhist chanting practice on that album. She was on 4 Beyond albums, and then she published a memoir that is a kind of self-help Buddhist teachings book called Happiness Becomes You in December of 2020. So this is her formal teaching career, right? From 2009 to 2020 and beyond, to the end of her life. And in her mature spiritual teachings, Turner, as you say, she moves from the private, the personal, to the public, right? Turner begins to ask and speak on what religion can do, what spiritual and religious practice can do in the public sphere, in society. One of the things that she emphasizes is the importance of sound, right? The usage of sound to contact what she considers to be deeper places inside of oneself. That sound can be vocalized prayer or mantra, as she herself practiced, right? The chanting of Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Turner understood the key to be doing those practices aloud, to open as what she called a space inside of oneself. That space she termed she considered the subconscious mind to be the key site of transformation. What in Soka Gakkai International Buddhism is the 9th layer of consciousness, which Turner referred to as the coin of the ultimate, the coin of the almighty inside of oneself, and what some Buddhist traditions call Buddha nature, right? All of this for Turner is essentially the same idea, and that is that, as Turner understands it, by contacting the subconscious mind, a person could change their life personally and the world around them socially. Key to that, then, is the orientation of one's self towards public value. This is coming out of Soka Gakkai International Buddhism and the understanding of that organization has about creating value in the world. And what Turner is adding in her teachings is that the way you create value is through sound and contacting the subconscious mind. And that's what will change you and give you the wisdom, the strength to change things around you. So her social teachings come out of those three understandings.
Great, thank you. Turner had all the karmic consequences of being a Black woman and growing up in the context that you described in Tennessee with sharecropping parents, sharecropping family. And you also, in the book, note on several occasions that she understood herself as a universal figure. And you also give a really beautiful account of setting her in the broader context of Buddhism among Black Americans or Black Buddhism. Wondering if you could say a little bit about how you understand Turner in the broader story of Black Buddhism.
Yes. So first of all, what Turner, so when I say listening to Turner and taking her seriously, right, what do we hear, right? What do we hear about American religion? And I think one of the things that Turner helps us to understand, and other figures like her, right, is that African American religiosity is not, nor has it ever been, nor will it ever be, just a story of the quote unquote Black church, which of course doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a monolithic Black church. There are African American Methodists, there are African American Baptists, there are African American Pentecostals, there are African American Catholics, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is no such thing as the Black church. This, of course, we know. But there is an assumption that most African Americans, right, or that forms of Afro-Protestant Christianity, specifically Baptist or Pentecostal, maybe Methodist, are the primary sites for the religiosity of African Americans. And that has never been true. This great scholar, Anthony B. Penn, who wrote the book Varieties of African American Religious Experience, for just this reason. Right. So Turner, as a Black Buddhist, contributes to our understanding of that. Buddhism has been in the United States for a long time. You could count from Buddhist ideas being here since the 18th century, or Buddhists themselves being here since the 19th century, and African American engagement with Buddhism, right? Definitely from the late 19th century, early 20th century onwards, and by the middle of the 20th century for sure. So Turner is indicative of this, right? That Buddhism is a part of the story of African American religion, just as Buddhism is a part of the story of American religion. Right? So that's the first thing we learned from Turner. Then when we talk about Black Buddhists, there has been a focus in scholarship on Buddhism on traditions that center silent meditation, silent introspective meditation of one kind or another. There's been this focus on that in the scholarship, and that's what most people think of when they think on a popular level of Buddhism. They think of someone silently meditating. But as we know, as many of your listeners will know, anybody who's engaged with the Barry Center will know, right, that that's never been what Buddhism has would solely looked like, what Buddhist practice has solely looked like. There are Buddhist study traditions, there are ritual traditions and chanting and all kinds of things. And so Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism is a Buddhist tradition that centers chanting, right? Its primary practice is chanting the mantra Nam Myoho Renge Kyo and portions of the Lotus Sutra, right? So that's its main practice. There is no silent meditation practice in that tradition. And so Turner then, when we talk about Black Buddhism, right, Soka Gakkai Nichiren Buddhism has been a significant tradition of Black Buddhism. And Turner has been one of its most famous, if not the most famous, adherent and advocate for those practices. But Turner is one of many. And that's one of the points of writing the book, to highlight Turner and use Turner as a specific case study, if you will, to understand American religion, American Buddhism, Black Buddhism, African American religion, Buddhism writ large. Right? To intervene in narratives of Buddhist studies and American Buddhism that exclude African Americans entirely, and to intervene in narratives about African American religion as being primarily and predominantly centered upon Afro-Protestant Christianity, right? Turner is herself an intervention in those conversations. And that's the work that the book seeks to do.
Thank you so much for laying that out, Ralph. I should say, for those people who might want to explore a Buddhism that is not purely silent, in May, there's a retreat at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies on exploring African American spirituals and protest songs as Dharma gates, singing for liberation. It's a BIPOC affinity retreat, so it's not open to everybody. But if this is something that interests you, I just put the link in the chat. Melanie Harris and Joshua Brian Campbell are the teachers. Joshua Campbell was nominated for an Academy Award for a song he originally wrote. Like, he was famous for a song he originally wrote for John Lewis, but I think he wrote the main song in the Harriet Tubman film, which was nominated for an Academy Award. And you may be interested in participating in that retreat. And I had some other questions. I didn't get a whole lot, I think. I've gotten a few texts of how much people are loving this program, but I did not get a whole lot of questions for you, Ralph.
Okay.
But I didn't get through all the ones that I had, and I trust that there will be more opportunities in the future. It is coming to the end of our time, and I really want to thank you for writing the book and for sharing what you've shared. I feel like, given your broad background and deep background in Buddhist studies and in theories of African American religion and contemporary religious life, and you've been able to take this figure, Tina Turner, that I think many people saw in one way, and really open up these other dimensions of who she is and what she offers. And that in itself is so rich and wonderful. And it reminds us that there are a lot of other people probably we can do this with. And what you've given us is a model, one model for how to do this. And I really want to thank you for that. I also want to say that at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, none of our teachers are under contract. They don't get a certain amount of money. we operate according to a dana model. So dana is the word that in Sanskrit and Pāli, South Asian Buddhist languages and South Asian languages, means don't gift or generosity. It's the first virtue of the bodhisattva. That is, it meets the needs, the immediate needs of the people around us, and it is also a certain relinquishment of things to which we cling. And frankly, in this political moment of, well, there are many ways to describe it, but maybe just largely, more broadly, a moment, a time when there's this hyper-capitalism. I love the practice of dana because it creates this this space that's an alternative to this dominant culture, a space in which teachers can come and trust in the community, and people in the community trust in the teachers, and it's this kind of collaborative holding. And our teachers need to pay for food and clothing and all the other things that we all need. And so there will be a link in the chat. Actually, there already is a link in the chat. Thank you, Christy, for offering dana. And another that is dana that would go to Ralph and also to support the logistics of making this happen at BCBS. And there's also a survey that Christy, thank you, put in the chat, just to get your response to this evening, if there are things that we can do better and suggestions that you might have. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's sweet to see familiar faces, and it's also lovely to see people I am not familiar with, and welcome to you. And Ralph, thank you so much for coming and for your work.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. And thank you for attending to this work. I wish you all the best.
Okay. And the book, as I said earlier, Dancing in My Dreams, it's very, very accessible. And I recommend it as a good read.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Be well.
Good night.